I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's July 16th, and we have a lot to talk about. Unless you happen to be in medical school, I think most people decide to learn about MS only once they or a loved one are diagnosed with MS, which means that at the moment you receive that diagnosis, you probably don't know very much about multiple sclerosis. And that's the moment when fear of the unknown can creep in, and you find yourself imagining the worst possible outcome. Even once you find reliable sources of information like the National MS Society's website, and you begin educating yourself about multiple sclerosis, that fear of the unknown morphs into that fear that goes with living with the uncertainty of MS. You wonder whether your MS is going to progress. You wonder if you'll still be able to take your kids to the park. You wonder if you'll still be able to keep your job. Even when things feel stable, that uncertain future can be frightening. As Harvard fellow Dr. Nara Michaelson began seeing patients who had recently been diagnosed with MS, she recognized that they shared characteristics that she had observed in victims of violent domestic abuse. She recognized the unraveling, and she wrote about it. Dr. Michaelson joins me today to talk about her award-winning essay, The Unraveling. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. Nara Michaelson, there are a few other things that you should know about. Evidence continues to grow showing that autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, or AHSCT, can be a safe and effective treatment for some people living with MS. High-efficacy disease-modifying therapies also represent a safe and effective treatment for some people living with MS. But how do these two very expensive yet quite different treatment options compare? Which does the better job of reducing or eliminating MS relapse activity? That's the question that the Beat MS clinical trial has been designed to answer. Beat MS is currently recruiting 110 people with relapsing remitting MS or secondary progressive MS with relapses to participate in this clinical trial that's taking place at 19 sites across the United States. Participants should be between the ages of 18 and 55, diagnosed with MS, and experiencing highly active treatment-resisting relapsing MS, which is being defined as experiencing 2 or more episodes of disease activity in the previous 36 months, with at least one of those episodes occurring while taking medication for MS. Now, as a quick review, in autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, an individual's stem cells are collected from their own bone marrow or blood. Those stem cells are stored while that person's immune system is mostly or completely depleted by chemotherapy. Then the stored stem cells are reintroduced into the body. The new stem cells migrate to the bone marrow and over time reconstitute a new or a rebooted immune system. And in many cases, the ability of this rebooted immune system to attack central nervous system myelin is greatly reduced or even eliminated, as are MS relapses. The high-efficacy disease-modifying therapies in this study include Tysabri, Lemtrada, Ocrevus, Rituxan, Kesimpta, Briumvi, and Mavenclad. Everyone enrolled in this study will receive treatment by either AHSCT or one of the high-efficacy DMTs, and the study results will focus on the length of time without relapses over 6 years. This trial is also going to track changes in relapse rate, disability progression, the rate of brain tissue loss, levels of neurofilament light chain, which is a protein that reflects damage to the nervous system, and of course any safety-related or adverse effects. As I mentioned a moment ago, this clinical trial is taking place at 19 sites across the United States, and to review those locations, learn more about the trial, or determine whether you're eligible to participate, please visit the study's website at beatms.org. That's beat-ms.org. And you'll find that link in today's show notes. Biotech company Abata Therapeutics has received FDA approval to launch a phase 1 clinical trial designed to test ABA-101, their experimental therapy for progressive MS. ABA-101 involves harvesting regulatory T cells from an individual and modifying them to focus their attention on myelin fragments. Then the modified cells are infused back into that same individual. But now, when those modified T cells sense damaged myelin, they produce an anti-inflammatory response specifically at the site where demyelination is occurring, reducing the inflammation that drives MS. ABA-101 is being developed for treating progressive MS in people who also have a specific genetic variation that affects their immune function. Abata estimates that this covers about 45,000 people living in the United States. The Abata team is expecting to launch their phase 1 clinical trial before the end of 2024, and we'll keep you posted as they announce their progress. We've been following Abata Therapeutics since 2021 when they first came out of stealth mode. If you'd like to hear my conversations with their president and CEO, Samantha Singer, and their chief medical officer, Dr. Richard Ransohoff, I'll invite you to check out episode 205 of Real Talk MS, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. I think we can agree that the price of MS disease-modifying therapy is unacceptably high. It's an issue that frustrates anyone having to pay a high out-of-pocket deductible for their DMT. It's a problem that MS activists continue to address with our legislators. But it's hard to fix any problem until you fully understand it. So, who is actually responsible for the high cost of prescription medications? Is it the pharmacy? Is it the drug manufacturer? Is it the insurance company? Well, when it comes to the price you pay for your prescription medications, you just may be overlooking an important player in the pharmaceutical supply chain, and that's the pharmacy benefit manager. Pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, are third-party administrators of prescription drug plans for insurance companies. These are the companies who create the formularies, the list of approved drugs that an insurance plan or a Medicare Part D prescription drug plan is going to make available to consumers. Those formularies also determine how much out-of-pocket expense you and I will have to pay for a specific prescription medication. Now, every drug manufacturer wants to see their prescription drugs included in these formularies, so the pharmacy benefit managers use that as leverage to negotiate deep discounts and rebates from the manufacturers. But no one knows how much these discounts and rebates are or where the money actually goes. Now, drug manufacturers tell us that the deep discounts they're already providing aren't getting through to the consumer. So until we shine a very bright light on the work that pharmacy benefit managers are doing, until we have real transparency in the entire prescription drug supply chain, we can't fix the problem. You can't fix what you can't see. But we may be getting closer to better understanding how pharmacy benefit managers operate. Last week, the Federal Trade Commission issued a 73-page report that capped a 2-year investigation into PBMs. Specifically, the FTC focused its investigation on CVS Health's Caremark, Cigna's Express Scripts, United Health Group's Optum RX, Humana's Pharmacy Solutions, Prime Therapeutics, and Med Impact. Together, these 6 PBMs control 94% of all U.S. drug prescriptions. And as you may have noticed, these pharmacy benefit managers are owned by pharmacies like CVS, for instance, and insurance companies like Cigna, United Health, and Humana. Now, if it strikes you that there ought to be some transparent distance between a PBM and a private insurance company, you may not be wrong. The FTC's report called out several questionable self-serving business practices that were observed. It also made mention of how uncooperative pharmacy benefit managers were when it came to sharing information with the FTC. The report called for further investigation of this multi-billion-dollar industry that operates completely out of public view. The investigation's initial conclusions, and I'm quoting directly from the report here, quote, urgently warrant further scrutiny and potential regulation. Rahul Rao, the deputy director of the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Competition, described the current state of gaining access to prescription medications in a manner that's going to sound very familiar to anyone who's on a disease-modifying therapy, saying, and again, I'm quoting here, we're seeing prices go up when in normal competition, prices should go down. We're seeing access decrease when competition should make access increase. And we're seeing that happen at a time when PBMs have been playing a more and more outsized role in the drug supply chain. The fix to that is something that we're exploring, end quote. Now that pharmacy benefit managers are on the FTC's radar, we'll have to wait and see what comes next. But it sounds like there may finally be some transparency and accountability involved in determining which part of the prescription medication supply chain is truly broken. If you'd like to review the FTC's report on pharmacy benefit managers, you'll find a link in today's show notes. This August 8th and 9th, my friends at Can Do MS are hosting a 2-day virtual program for people who have been newly or recently diagnosed with MS and their caregivers. The free program is called Take Charge, and it's designed to help attendees learn more about MS, network with others who are living with MS, and hear from MS specialists who are going to be sharing strategies for managing MS symptoms and living your best life. Topics covered in the Take Charge program include resilience strategies, how to cope with a new diagnosis, tools that you can use to start conversations with members of your MS care team, and how to take action to improve your quality of life. The program is free, but in order to provide every attendee with the best experience possible, participation is limited. So if you're interested in taking charge of your MS, you can visit the Can Do MS website to apply, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. Taking charge of your MS is an important and empowering step that usually follows that more immediate sense of shock and fear when you're first diagnosed. As Harvard fellow Dr. Nara Michaelson treated people with MS, she recognized that they shared characteristics that she had observed in victims of violent domestic abuse. In a moment, we'll meet my guest, Dr. Nara Michaelson. Dr. Nara Michaelson is a multiple sclerosis fellow at Harvard's Massachusetts General Hospital. And just last month, the scientific journal Neurology published an article written by Dr. Michaelson titled The Unraveling. And that article went on to win the Best Essay Award by the Consortium of Residents and Fellows. I found Dr. Michelson's article to be compelling and important, so it's a pleasure to welcome you to the podcast, Dr. Michaelson.
Thank you so much. I'm a huge fan of your podcast, long-time listener, first-time caller, as they say, so thrilled to be here.
Well, before we get to your article, I introduced you just a moment ago as a fellow, so I hope you'll take a moment to explain to our listeners what a fellow is.
Absolutely. So a fellow is a neurologist who completed their residency training in neurology and is now subspecializing in another branch of neurology. So for me, it's multiple sclerosis and neuroimmunology. And there's actually many different fellowships within neurology. Neurology is almost like its own world, if you can imagine, anything from stroke and critical care to multiple sclerosis and epilepsy, movement disorders.
And what was it that led you to focus on multiple sclerosis and neuroimmunology?
And so many wonderful aspects. I mean, the patients are fantastic. It's great to work with especially younger patient population, and to follow them throughout their life. And, it's also just a very fascinating disease in itself. And then so inspiring, all the many advances, just even within the last 40 years in terms of clinical trials and very effective therapies. So I kind of think of it as like a really amazing example within neurology of being able to understand a very debilitating disease and to develop treatments and help patients live better lives as a result.
So let's get into your article. What is the Unraveling about? How did you arrive at that title for your article?
Yeah.
And what motivated you to write such a thoughtful and thought-provoking piece?
Yeah, excellent questions. So the Unraveling is about my experience over the past year as a multiple sclerosis fellow, and it's specifically talking about patients who are newly diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So when I started my fellowship, I was at Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is another one of our hospitals. And in my Friday morning clinic, we had a 8 a.m. slot that was specifically devoted to new patients. And, I would always kind of anticipate, what my new patients are going to be like. And then I came to realize over the course of a few months that new patient kind of fell into 3 different categories. So I talk about in my article about how there's the patient that is actually someone who has longstanding multiple sclerosis, and they're a new patient to me, meaning that they're transferring their care to me. So they're actually very well versed in multiple sclerosis, and probably even were diagnosed before treatments were even available. So that's one category. The second category is someone who's a new patient, but they might have been told by another provider that they had multiple sclerosis, and they're coming to me for a second opinion, maybe to make sure that there's nothing that's being missed. So that was the second category, someone who was coming to terms with the diagnosis or possible diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. Then the third category was kind of the more, poignant in my mind, the patient who was having symptoms, was looking for an explanation, and had never been told about multiple sclerosis before, maybe never even really heard about it or understood what it was. And so that was the patient that really had a lot to discover about this disease. And for that patient especially, their whole world kind of gets turned upside down. And just being there with that patient, that type of patient in particular, and seeing kind of them having to start to learn about this condition and start to think about reorganizing their life in a very different way.
When you talk about that group of patients, the ones who haven't yet been diagnosed but soon will be, and in your article you talk about their fear and anxiety as they consider the uncertainty that they're living with. I know that for many people with MS, getting that diagnosis is in some ways a relief. After living with unexplained symptoms, sometimes for years, finally getting a definitive diagnosis resolves the mystery, and I think more importantly, it actually allows them to begin treatment. Now, in my experience as my wife's care partner, I saw that fear and anxiety doesn't always disappear once someone is diagnosed, because living with the unpredictability of MS means learning to live with uncertainty, and that quiet anxiety, that worry that's always simmering on a back burner in your mind, well, that can take a toll on an individual's quality of life, can it?
Absolutely. And, I talk about how we've made so many advances in treatment over the last few decades, but we still don't have an effective treatment for progression. So I absolutely can empathize with that anxiety because we aren't yet able to halt the disease in its tracks. We can prevent the acute inflammatory attacks. But I absolutely understand and, validate that anxiety and that fear, because there's still a lot of work that we have to do in MS. I think about how it's almost like a marathon. I feel like we've come halfway and there's still so much more to really make it to the end of combating this disease.
Your article reminds us that women are almost 3 times more likely than men to be diagnosed with MS. And when you think about how MS impacts women across their lifespan, having to maybe balance disease-modifying therapies and pregnancy, to the changes in how MS progresses at menopause, in many cases, I think it's fair to consider MS as a women's health issue. Well, you illustrate that in your article when you write about a single mother with 3 children at home who has a demanding job, and now she's diagnosed with MS. And one of her first thoughts is, I can't afford to lose my health insurance, which could happen if she reaches a point where she could no longer work. I think you make the case that these additional responsibilities that often fall onto the shoulders of women become invisible aspects of living with MS that we don't always think about, even when we're considering the invisible symptoms of MS.
Absolutely. And that was one of my motivations for writing this piece, to give voice to those patients in particular. And one of the things too, as a woman, so much of society depends on what women do. I really think of women as the backbone of society in a lot of ways. And in a lot of ways, women enjoy serving that role, but it is a lot of additional responsibility when they themselves are trying to manage a very, at times, complicated disease. So I'm so glad that message got through. And I think it was really important to highlight all these different perspectives and aspects of the disease.
Your experience includes treating women who have been victims of domestic abuse. And in your article, you write about women who have experienced domestic abuse and women who are living with MS as both experiencing what you write as a palpable sense of entrapment, trapped within their own bodies or trapped within toxic relationships. I just found that to be a fascinating and an extraordinarily unfortunate parallel there. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So I remember reading about a patient, this patient had rheumatoid arthritis. And I remember reading about a case about a patient with very advanced rheumatoid arthritis, and their rheumatologist kind of was seeing them in a visit and kind of said to the patient, it's like you're being abused by your disease. And I think that stuck with me. And as I was seeing patients, and especially patients who were diagnosed prior to treatment, that idea of some of these patients just having so much disability from their disease, I think it reminded me of that phrase, like being kind of almost experiencing abuse as a result. And yes, I have worked with women who were in very abusive domestic violence relationships. And, I think, again, I saw a parallel between the lack of trust too. It's also when you have an autoimmune condition, it's, thinking about how your body could turn against itself when you should be able to trust yourself. You should be able to trust your body. So I think that was another theme that I wanted to highlight. And, as a neurologist and an MS fellow, I get so much joy in helping patients kind of regain trust in kind of their own control over their lives. And I think that's one of the amazing things about having so many treatments, over 20 FDA approved treatments for multiple sclerosis, to be able to offer hope to patients and say that this is what you have, but we have so many ways to get this under control and to give them a sense of safety and to escape that feeling of being powerless against this disease.
I was also very moved by exactly what you just described. As you say it in your article, and I wrote it down, so I'm going to quote directly now, how you empower your patients to reweave the disruptive tapestry of their lives and regain their control. You just talked about disease-modifying therapies, certainly as being one way to deal with the physiology of what's happening. What other steps are necessary for that person to reweave the disruptive tapestry of their lives?
That's a great question. And I wanted to highlight on this interview so many resources that are available to newly diagnosed patients in particular, but all patients and their family members. So one of the wonderful organizations that you mentioned repeatedly on your podcast is the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. And, as I was preparing for this interview, I wanted to come with resources for patients who may be listening to this podcast and highlight some really key resources that are available. So I actually spoke with the National MS Society, and there are so many ways that patients can get help and have a supportive community, whether in person or virtually, to get actual advice on how to live with a diagnosis of MS. And, all you really have to do is visit the National MS Society.org website, and, you could either email them or call them, or they even have a chat function. And the most important takeaway is that they have these amazing advocates called patient navigators and MS patient navigators. And you just basically, if you don't know where to start, they will help you. They basically go through very extensive training, 8 weeks of training, so that they're informed about how to help your very specific problem, whether it's getting financial support or getting emotional support or learning more about the disease. They're there to help you through this in addition to your neurologist. So I don't want anyone listening to this to ever feel like that they're alone. There's just a really amazing community ready to help you. So I really wanted to highlight that.
And I think you just have done a masterful job. You've stolen all the things I usually get to say. So, but I'll go ahead and add that in my opinion, and my listeners have heard it before, I think the Navigator program is the gold standard when it comes to delivering that one-on-one personalized support for, as you just mentioned, whatever that individual needs help with. I'll also add that the Navigators have added sort of a new wrinkle to what it is they do to make sure you don't have to waste a lot of time trying to connect with someone. Now you can make an appointment with an MS Navigator, so they'll be ready for you and you'll know exactly when to connect with them. Well, Dr. Nara Michaelson, I appreciate the perspective you bring to your work at the clinic. I want to thank you for all you do and all you will do as your career continues to unfold for the people who are living with MS. And thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/359. You'll find that link in today's show notes so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. I hope you'll join me next week when Dr. Riley Beauvais, a neurologist and associate professor of neurology at the University of California, San Francisco, will be on hand to discuss how digital technology is proving to be a game changer when it comes to diagnosing, treating, and managing MS. In the meantime, I hope you'll pay a visit to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.